Hi everyone and welcome to my channel and to this time-lapse version of 4 black Labradors in soft pastel. If you enjoy this here then please do hit subscribe, and as always there'll be longer tutorials from this piece over on my Patreon channel. This is a rather large painting at 24 inches tall, and I chose the purple colour of pastel matte paper, as you can see here. This is my line drawing. I always sketch my outlines on a normal piece of drawing paper so that I can perhaps use a grid, as I did in this case, just for some extra accuracy with all of their little faces. And then I'll usually transfer that drawing onto my pastel paper so that I get a nice, crisp, clean line to start with. But as always, I make a start with the background. And I have popped the client photo that I've worked from here up in the top corner just for the first little bit of this time lapse so that you can see what I was working from. I did create some layouts on Photoshop to move the dogs around a little bit and change the composition a little bit. But this is pretty much what I was working from, and I had to try and figure out how I was going to create such a busy background and still make the dogs stand out in front of that. So that was the main problem I knew I would encounter here. I wanted to create a splash of colour and an idea of the lovely pattern that the leaves create. But I knew that if I went into a lot of detail in the background, that the dogs might just get lost in the composition and they wouldn't really pop out from the background like I normally like to create in my paintings. So for the first good few hours of this piece, I really played with this background, adding in my marks, but then coming back in multiple times to blend and soften those marks. I eventually decided that the only way forward was to leave no hard edges in the background, for everything to look really blurred and slightly out of focus. So I work the left side of the background first, trying to get a little section of it almost complete so that I can get a picture in my head what it's going to look like, because I don't always start off with a clear plan of what to do. Sometimes I really am thinking as I go, and that was definitely the case with this piece. And you'll see as I work on each individual dog that I continue to work on the little bits of background just around that dog, trying to help the dog stand out as much as possible. And of course, because the painting is quite large, you would expect the dogs to be quite large and quite simple to paint in this, but in actual fact, because there are so many of them and they're quite small within the scene, and because they're big dogs, so black Labrador breed, that means that each little face is relatively tiny in comparison to the size of the painting. Now, when I told my patrons that I was working on this piece, a lot of them came back to me and said that they've been getting a lot of requests for smaller pet portraits and that they would be really interested to see how to create the faces on a smaller scale like this. And of course, it is something that I've been asked to do over the years. But with soft pastel, sometimes going smaller is actually making the job much harder. Because the soft pastel sticks are quite blunt instruments, the smaller you go, the smaller your details may need to be, and that can become trickier with the big sticks. So you can see, as always, I'm coming in with some pastel pencil, and that's really helpful in this piece for the very smallest of details. But I'm still making a lot of use of those bigger sticks and that really vibrant, strong pigment that you get from the sticks. So next month on Patreon, I'm going to release a series of tutorials based on painting smaller faces, bodies too, but we'll especially focus on how to get the likeness when the scale is so small. Now, there are many things that I do differently when I'm painting a smaller portrait like this than if I'm painting something with a lot of detail where the head is much bigger and you can actually put lots of detail in one eye, for example. In this case, it's a struggle just to get the details in the tiny eyes with the very fine points of my pencils. But in some ways, there is a lot of detail that you can leave out. So clearly I'm not able to fit as much detail as I normally would. So how do I paint with less detail and yet still get something quite realistic at the end? So I'll talk lots about that in my tutorial series from this piece. And I have some other paintings that I'm going to use to demo this idea as well. So next month it's going to be painting on a smaller scale. But I would say, just as a caution, if you're taking on pet portrait commissions in soft pastel, it's best to not let clients believe that going smaller will mean much cheaper. For example, sometimes it takes me longer to paint something that's really tiny, so why would I charge less money for that? But I think most people would expect that if you buy something smaller, you'll pay less money for it. So on my website over the years, where I've advertised my commissions, I've always avoided listing prices for smaller pieces. Sometimes I will work on a small painting on request and I will quote accordingly for the reference image. But it's not always the case that I'm going to be able to do it quicker just because it's smaller. In fact, sometimes it's the opposite. So be careful if you're taking on pet commissions. Booking in lots and lots of A4 sized pet commissions at less money is actually really going to stress you out unless you're using predominantly pencils or another medium that it's easier to get those very tiny little details. But if you're working in soft pastel, definitely do not underprice your smaller portraits, as you're going to find that they take you a lot of time. So I went back to the background every so often. I would get a little bit of a dog done. I was certainly a lot happier by this stage that I had two of the dogs looking at me. And I worked on it a bit more of the background now just to fill in some of the gaps. I have a lot of tutorials on my Patreon channel all about painting different sorts of backgrounds. That's always something that I love to include, and especially if it adds to the portrait or makes it that extra bit special. And I think it does in this case because it's clear that these dogs love to be outdoors, and I loved the fact that the rhododendron bush behind added a lovely splash of pinks. So you can really use your backgrounds to bring extra colour into your paintings. But as I always say in my background tutorials, don't expect the background to happen quickly. You're going to spend possibly just as long, if not longer, on a very complicated background as you will on the main subject itself. So part of the key to painting backgrounds is to have patience with them. I do remember starting out when I avoided painting backgrounds at all costs, and then getting frustrated if I tried to paint something like grass or something natural around the pet in my portrait. And I quickly realised years later that I really wasn't spending enough time on the backgrounds. I was trying to skip over that part and get straight to the animal, which I would love to paint, but the backgrounds always made me uncomfortable. So I have many tips and tricks to help you along with painting backgrounds, as that's the journey I've been on throughout my career. And I hope that I can pass some of that along to you guys. If there's something in particular that you're struggling with, then have a look through my tutorial library. You can browse all of my tutorials before signing up on Patreon just by going to my website, emmacolbertart.com, and you'll find my full library there, If you're struggling with something in particular in a background or a certain breed of dog, then just have a browse through my tutorials, see if I've covered something similar. I know that a lot of my patrons use my tutorials like this, more as guidance for the painting that they're working on at the time. And I'm even thrilled to learn that some of them stick my tutorials on while they're working, just for a bit of company in their studio. So I'm always really chuffed to hear that, and I hope that I provide good company for an artist in their studio. It's a nice thought for me. So on to the final dog, and this was a real marathon. I had to split this painting up over the last month, but really only getting short bursts at it. I would maybe get half of a dog done one day and then come back to it the next day to finish that dog. And that's how the month went, really, just chipping away in little pieces. Doing my best to film the whole thing too. This was a very difficult piece to film because it's such a big painting, and then there is such tiny detail in some of the faces, and I really needed to get my face right in front of the painting, so that's why I appear in this video so much. It was almost impossible to get a clear view of what I was doing for both me and the camera, so sometimes that's a problem. But I really wanted to capture as much of this as I possibly could. And I'm going to focus in some in-depth tutorials on the dog's faces and bodies in particular. Interestingly, in this painting, because of the position of each dog, they've all got a slightly different scale of face, ranging from just 5 centimeters in height to about 10 centimeters in height with this last dog, which is closer to us in the foreground. So it will be interesting to show each of those different scale of dog heads and explain how I went about that. So the final bit of work on the foreground. I didn't want to add too much detail into the foreground. It's already such a busy painting. It was my aim just to get these final 2 paws that are coming out towards the viewer, to get those nicely detailed and standing out against the ground beneath. But in this case, I figured that less was more for the foreground. And I hope that you've enjoyed seeing this come together, even though it's a particularly speedy version. This piece took me over 17 or so hours of painting time, but then of course lots of extra hours of sketching it out, coming up with the Photoshop layout. Probably around 25 hours total work on this piece. So I hope that you've enjoyed seeing it squashed into just over 10 minutes here. I hope that you'll stick around and watch some of my other videos here on YouTube. And of course, please do hit subscribe. Then if you'd like to check out even more of my tutorials, do visit me on Patreon or on my Patreon tutorials library on my website. But thanks very much for watching this here, and until next time, happy pasteling.